The expansion of NATO in the face of Russia's invasion of Ukraine is one step closer to completion. Sweden is poised to become the latest member of the Defence Alliance, as its neighbour, Finland, succeeded in its membership bid earlier on this year. Now, that expansion of NATO was part of the discussion earlier this month at a meeting of defence ministers in Brussels. Sweden's application now all depends on the Turkish parliament ratifying that application. President Erdogan removed a final hurdle last week by submitting a bill to his parliament. Turkey and Hungary remain the only NATO members whose legislatures have yet to sign off on Sweden's accession. So for more on this, we have brought together two former prime ministers. Joining us from Helsinki is current presidential candidate Alexander Stubb. He's also the former prime minister and foreign minister of Finland and director of the School of Transnational Governance. Thank you for being with us.
My pleasure.
And also joining us from Stockholm is Carl Bildt. He's the former Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of Sweden and co-chair of the European Council on Foreign Relations. Welcome to you too, Mr. Bildt.
Thank you.
And of course, we are going to get to that discussion on NATO in just a moment. But of course, we also want to discuss the ongoing conflict in the Middle East. We know that there was a vote ahead of a resolution by the UN that was put forward in the past few days. Mr. Stubb, I'll start with you. Finland recently abstained from that UN vote, calling for a humanitarian sustained truce in the Israel-Hamas war in order to allow for aid to come through into Gaza. Now, you've talked about the importance of reaching a ceasefire as soon as possible. What did you make about your country's decision here to abstain in that vote?
I think there were two issues there. One was that Finland hadn't had its voice heard yet in the General Assembly. And from what I understand, the other one was that we wanted to have a stronger condemnation of any violation of humanitarian and international law. So it wasn't really for or against, it was somewhere in between. In other words, a call for a ceasefire.
And then I do want to also ask you, Mr. Bildt, because we know that your country also did choose to abstain within this vote. And there has been a lot of questions regarding consensus in the EU. We know that there was, in fact, a letter that was written by some EU officials, 800 EU officials, regarding Ursula von der Leyen's stance in regards to the Israeli-Hamas conflict here. And so I'm wondering how difficult consensus is, and also to you whether or not your country made the right choice in abstaining in this critical vote.
Well, I think there were quite a number of EU countries that abstained, but the regrettable fact was, of course, that there was a serious split. We had, out of the 27 members of the European Union, 8 voted in favor, 4 voted against, and the rest abstained. So it was not the most glorious moment of the European Union. I think Canada abstained as well, but I might be wrong on that one.
Canada did abstain.
Yeah, quite. As a matter of fact, if you look at the United States, that sort of voted no. The others that voted no, there was no major US ally whatsoever that voted no on the resolution.
Of course, part of the concern here is on whether or not this shifts to a larger conflict within the region. Mr. Stubb, I've certainly heard you also discuss in some public remarks a shifting world order. And there have been these mounting concerns that that war, as we were discussing, between Israel and Hamas could spiral into a wider conflict and potentially draw in a number of other actors. So how do you see this playing out, and what will then be the role of EU countries?
Well, I guess the starting point is to understand that whenever a power vacuum emerges, as one could argue happened with the US being more or less absent in the Middle East peace process for the past 10, 15 years, then at some stage someone's going to fill that vacuum. So it can be Iran, it could be Turkey, it could be Russia or Israel, or out of the terrorist organizations, it could be Hamas, Hezbollah, or ISIS. But I think the U.S. is now back. We've seen a lot of diplomacy coming from President Biden, coming from Foreign Secretary Blinken. So I don't think this is going to escalate. But of course, in these kinds of situations, it's very important to keep in mind that the conflict should remain local and not regional. And from what I understand from the statements coming out from the Arab League and other players in the region, they certainly don't want to escalate this. But, this is, I think, a sign of bigger times. So who benefits from this? And I'm sure Carl can take over. But, Iran and Russia are benefiting for any kind of instability in the region, and the Americans have to go in and help.
And Mr. Bildt, I wanted to also return to one of the topics that we were discussing, and that is when we are talking about the EU's potential future role as we continue to watch how this all unfolds, and the accusations that were sort of launched against the bloc's chief, suggesting that there were double standards. I'm looking at some words that were published by you, Mr. Bildt, saying respect for international law, especially international humanitarian law, is paramount. It is the foundation on which a peaceful future might be built. How closely are you watching that? Is international law and international humanitarian law being abided by?
Well, there are a couple of sort of key international actors, the UN and ICRC, that are seriously questioning whether that is the case. What I think is particularly important from the European point of view is that we have a war going on in Europe. And our sort of firm opposition to the Russian aggression against Ukraine is based on international law. And if there is a perception in the rest of the world that we treat international law as something a la carte, that you can take whatever you want at the time and place of choosing, then of course there's a risk of that undermining the credibility of our case with the extremely important issue of Russia's aggressions against Ukraine. So it has implications, needless to say, for the Gaza war and limiting the effects of that, limiting, as Alex said, the risk of escalation. But it does also affect our credibility when they come to the, from our point of view, extremely important Ukraine war.
And of course, let's now focus in on the subject of NATO. Mr. Bildt, I'll stay with you for that because I want to dive a little bit deeper, of course, into Sweden's ongoing campaign for membership into the alliance. We know that Turkey's President Erdogan did recently clear the way by submitting your country's NATO bid to his parliament for ratification. However, some have said that before they approve, the country approves, Sweden must address their concerns about what they deem to be terrorist organizations in the country. So what's your response to that?
Well, we, together with Finland, by the way, we went into a memorandum and agreement with Turkey last summer to address some of these concerns. That applied particularly to Sweden, I have to confess, and I think we've done it. But the Turks would say more needs to be done. We agree with that. This is an ongoing issue. Terrorism is not something that you address one week and then we forget about the next week. But we have adjusted our policies and our structures in order to be able to do that. So I think it should be ready for the Turkish parliament to move forward with the ratification. Then we have the Hungarians playing some games, but the games of Mr. Orban belongs to another universe, I think.
So in terms then of these obstacles that perhaps you're looking at when it comes to Turkey, but also as you've highlighted with Hungary as well, when we're talking about the two nations who have yet to permit that green light there, how soon do you see a timeline?
It's very difficult to say, but obviously we are a victim of the fact that there are a lot of other issues on the agenda at the moment. Turkey is very close to the conflict in the Middle East, obviously. They have a conflict in the Caucasus. They have a problem in Syria. So I can understand it's very busy times in Ankara. We would hope that it would be put on the agenda of the Grand National Assembly, as is the name of their parliament, within the next few weeks. And we will hope that there will be a consensus on it as well. And then what the Hungarians will do, that's beyond me.
We'll have to continue to watch that. Mr. Stubb, I want to bring you into this conversation too, because of course we know that Finland applied to join NATO at the same time as Sweden. Your country officially became a member back in April. We had a conversation back then, and both countries have had a history of neutrality. And then there were some shifts, some geopolitical shifts that shifted the perception and then the decisions of both of your countries to make this application bid. And we know, Mr. Stubb, that your country did join back in April. Do you see any shifts since that point of joining the alliance?
Oh, not really, but just perhaps a little gentle correction. Finland hasn't been a neutral country since the end of the Cold War. We were militarily non-aligned, and later on we just didn't belong to a military alliance. But we've always been, much like Sweden, very close to NATO, close partners. And we made sure in the early 1990s, when we didn't join NATO, that we'd be so compatible with NATO that if the day came that we needed to apply, it would happen quickly, and it has. But to be honest, not much has shifted. And also, Carl and I have tried to calm down the debate in both Finland and Sweden, me particularly in Sweden, saying that even if Sweden is not de jure, by law, a NATO member yet, it basically has de facto the security guarantees and is a member of NATO. So I'm not excessively worried. Finland and Sweden bring a lot into the alliance. We are security providers, not security consumers. Just to give you one ballpark figure, when all the Nordic countries are taken together, so Denmark, Norway, Iceland, Finland, and Sweden, we actually provide the alliance with 250 fighter jets. So I'm not too worried about this. It's just unfortunate that Sweden has had to wait for a little bit longer, but we are with Sweden on this. We have always been and will continue to be so.
Now, Mr. Stubb, I also wanted to ask you how you see then the shift in terms of what we're watching happening in the Middle East, the countries who are involved in that, and also the world's attention shifting away from Ukraine and Russia as a more immediate situation has emerged, so to speak. So what do you think happens there? How does that play out when we're watching these two conflicts?
It's a sign of times. In other words, I think that the end of the post-Cold War era came upon us in February 2022, and that's when the power balance and the world order started to shift. So in many ways, it's our 1918, 1945 or 1989 moment. And in my mind, it might take up to 10 years for things to settle. And this power balance is quite uneasy. We're living in what Carl would probably call a time of unrest, or Mark Leonard, who he works with in the European Council of Foreign Relations, would call an age of unpeace. So we'll be seeing these types of conflicts. I myself, chairman of the board of Martti Ahtisaari's CMI Peace Foundation. And what we find is that in the past 20 to 30 years, a lot of the conflicts have been local, but now they're becoming more state to state, like what we're seeing between Russia and Ukraine, and to a certain extent, you could say, well, between Hamas, which is a non-state actor, and then Israel. So we will see this period of unrest, but I think it's very important that we keep a cool, calm, and collected approach, and especially cool heads in all of this, and try to contain the different conflicts that we're seeing emerge in the rest of the world. Final point. I hope that nothing will flare up in the Sahel region. I hope nothing will flare up between Kosovo and Serbia, and I hope that it won't get any worse in Nagorno-Karabakh. But this is just a time period of unrest that we're living in right now, unfortunately.
And then to that end, Mr. Bildt, I want to ask you, as Russia's war on Ukraine is well into its second year, the war unfolding in the Middle East, as we've been discussing, has added this new challenge to the geopolitical landscape. So then how concerned are you that this diversion of global attention could potentially give Putin the leeway to act unmonitored, could be of benefit to Russia?
I am concerned with that. I'm particularly concerned that countries in what we refer to as a somewhat dubious term, the Global South, that they will shift attention even more than they've done in the past. But then, critically important for Ukraine is, of course, that we sustain the support that we give them. That's both the military support and, I would say, equally important, the financial support that is given by Canada, United States, the European Union, that is sustained, so that the Ukrainians can continue to defend themselves and step by step also take back that territory. That is absolutely essential for the security of all of Europe as we look ahead.
And finally, for both of you, Mr. Bildt, Mr. Stubb, I wanted to ask, and I know, Mr. Stubb, you've touched on this already, in terms of the roles that these countries will play, both of your countries will play when it comes to the NATO alliance. I'm wondering at what stage we may expect the countries to play a more active role when it comes to these geopolitical concerns. Mr. Stubb, first I'll ask you, and then Mr. Bildt, I'll go to you.
I think we'll be as active as it gets. I think our NATO membership is what I would call an unlimited NATO membership. So when Finland joined the European Union in 1995, we became very much part of the core of Europe. We joined the Euro, didn't put any limits in our membership. And you'll see the same thing happening with NATO as well. We fully understand that we have a big role in protecting our allies up in the northeastern corner of Europe. And the reason for that is very simple. We have 1,340 kilometers of border with Russia. So we're not a hotspot, but we are geopolitically one of the most important countries in the alliance, and we'll play our part. And to be honest, we'll play it very closely with our closest partner, which is Sweden.
And of course, Mr. Bildt, we know that we are still waiting for the green light when it comes to your country's, joining of the alliance. But same question for you in terms of an active role.
Yeah, and I would add to what Alex said that we are now, together with Finland, we are part of a geostrategic area of Northern Europe and the North Atlantic. And we will, together with all of the Nordic and Baltic partners, play an active role there. We have now a strategic area, strategic perspective that stretches from, say, the city of Narva on the Estonian-Russian border in the east to the city of Nuuk, the capital of Greenland on the west coast of Greenland. That's a huge area of significant strategic importance, with the Arctic coming into the picture, the transatlantic link, Northern Europe, and the close vicinity of the greatest concentration of nuclear weapons in the world up in Murmansk, and the second biggest city of Russia, St. Petersburg, 6 million people in the east. So it's a fairly important area where we will do whatever we can to safeguard the stability.
Well, I certainly wish this conversation could continue, and I very much appreciate the insights from both of you. Thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.
That is the
Thanks
former...
a lot. And Carl, you owed me a message.
Thank you so much, Mr. Stubb.
I got a message from you. I'll deal with that and see if anything...
This is how we deal in Finland and Sweden. It's very informal, you know.
The former Prime Minister and current presidential candidate of Finland, Alexander Stubb, in Helsinki, and former Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of Sweden, Carl Bildt, in Stockholm. Thank you to both of you.
All the best. Thanks. Bye.